Welcome to From Eyes, From My Eyes to Yours.
In our first episode, we have Dr Shimanto, who is the youngest specialist orthodontist to be registered in Australia.
And now runs a successful practice by the name of Norwest Orthodontics.
His current fleet is all performance-based with the likes of a Mercedes Benz GLC 63,
A BMW M3, and our personal favourite, his McLaren 720S.
Through this interview, we touch on topics such as how he decided on his career path,
The struggles and triumphs of starting up your own business,
and most likely why you were here, is how these latter two topics made supercar ownership possible for him,
and how you could potentially make this a reality for yourself as well. So with that being said, thank you for tuning in, and let's jump straight into the interview. Right, this is From Eyes. Now, today we have Dr. Shimanto. Now, father, husband, record-setting specialist orthodontist.
And soon to be lap record holder at City Motorsport Park once your next car arrives.
Wink, wink. We're not going to disclose
But
that.
all jokes aside, like, you're a terrific track driver. This is your weapon of choice that is parked up behind us. Anthony?
Now, for those who do not know what this is, why don't you start by telling us exactly what it is?
Thank you very much for having me, boys. Well, getting right, directly answering your question, the vehicle sitting behind us is the McLaren 720S. Okay, so it's a part of the Super Series range of McLaren cars. Believe it or not, this is actually theoretically their GT cars, the car which you can take for coffee on Sunday morning and then take it to the track, and then in the afternoon or in the evening go out for dinner. So currently, my personal preference for vehicles are the McLarens, and I've been driving McLarens now for coming up to 2016, 2018, so 4 years now. This is my second, and the third is on the way in the next few months. So I've been very, very happy with the company, and I've been particularly delighted with the people behind the company. Like what we've spoken about before is, I do obviously have certain brands I prefer, but I'm not a die-hard brand loyalist. So I'm realistic enough to look at any product that comes on the market and assess for me which is the most potent weapon to take on track. Currently, I think you're going to find it hard pressed to go past the McLaren lineup, and perhaps my driving style suits the nature of the cars that they engineer. But what's really also important for me is the people behind the brand that actually make it. I started with McLarens back in 2016 with the 570S. So I came out of Porsches, just normal Carreras, not the GT series, just normal Carreras. And the first performance driving experience I ever had was with the Porsche Motorsport School. I didn't know anything about driving. I thought I was fast. I wasn't. I was reckless, and there was a serious discrepancy between my perception of my ability and the objective assessment of my ability. Having said that, after doing this Porsche Motorsport School, a couple of them pulled me aside and said, look, perhaps there's some potential there, and what are you driving? And I said at that time I was driving a 991.1 series Carrera S, and they said, yeah, look, that's too slow for you. Why don't you jump into a GT Porsche? So I went to Porsche, and at that point in time I had no history with the brand. GT cars, particularly during the 991.1s were hard to get. A little bit easy, it seems like now in the second gen. They probably produced more of them. So they said, look, we can't get you one of those. So I said, well, what's the next thing in your model lineup that's got big horsepower and is faster than what I've got? So they said, well, let's go Porsche Turbo, which is very much more a GT car. Yeah. So I was umming and ahhing and thinking, should I put my order in? And then a friend of mine, who's an extremely good driver, had spent some time in Dubai, and he'd driven a McLaren 650S. And he came back and he said, you're mad if you do anything except jump into McLarens. These things are absolute weapons. So I rang up McLaren Sydney, and at that point in time, they had launched their 570. This was so they'd launched it, I think, in about 2015. So I think a few cars had started to arrive. So this is now in 2016. So I think that it's about a year after the market launch. So there's usually a delay from when they launch it in Europe. Typically, McLaren launches at Geneva. So they launch it in March of any given year. And by the time we see Australian customer cars, it's the end of that year, or realistically about 12 months later. So it's about 12 months later. And I rang up McLaren Sydney and said, look, I'm interested in a 570S. So I still remember brought it out to me, which is very nice, parked it out. There was a bright orange one in the classical McLaren orange. So I said, okay, let's go for a drive. There may or may not be a particular route through my suburb that if you link or do not link roads together, may make quite a nice little route, let's say, if we can put it that way, nice little route where you can drive assertively.
Yes. In Mexico.
In Mexico, across the border. Not around here at all. And I jumped in the car and I just realized the agility was unbelievable. It was agile. That was the first thing I noticed. The steering feel and steering precision was out of this world. Even on the road, I could brake deeper into the braking zones than I'd ever dared before. And the raw acceleration. These things, when they hook up and go, the acceleration is otherworldly. So how they can get that much power through just two rear wheels when almost every other manufacturer needs to go all-wheel drive to get the power down and get the traction down, these guys don't. So what was meant to be a 5-minute test drive to get a feeler for the car probably ended up at about 40 laps around the suburb. So the car came back, I'd probably burnt through about 30-40% of the tyres and probably half the brake pads. So I felt obligated to put an order in, which is what I did. And that was how my McLaren journey basically started. Specifically talking about this vehicle, so look, this is a 720S, in theory 720 metric horsepower, which I think equates to about 537 kilowatts is what they tell me. And whether it actually is pumping out that or more, most people say it's probably pumping out more. They've sandbagged a little bit, but well, you felt it on track, so. Why I like it? Well, getting back to your question, I mean, I've digressed. Why do I like it? Well, I think if you're going to take a car on track and you're going to have, first of all, it has to be fast. But in addition to raw horsepower, what it also needs to be is it needs to handle well. And that means it needs to be balanced well, it needs to be predictable. I personally prefer cars which are set up to oversteer rather than understeer. I prefer them to rotate through the corner. I'm quicker that way rather than sort of having to manage the understeer. I think most guys who drive on track prefer that setup, which is a little bit different to how perhaps you'd set up a classical road car, where you'd perhaps set it up more for the understeer tendency rather than oversteer tendency. And these certainly do have a tendency to rotate in. The other thing that's key is your brakes. The later you can brake, the more speed you can carry through the corner. You shorten the distance between corners, you're going to end up being faster. I've never driven anything that stops as well as this. Huge brakes, carbon ceramics, and it's light.
Well, you mentioned that you haven't driven something like that. Just to take it back for a second, is where did your passion for cars really stem from, in a way? Because there's people out there right now where they may be driving just their parents' car or something, or just $1,000 bomb that they can just drive for now, and they had this aspiration to drive something like that. Kind of having that understanding of where you actually came from car-wise, like where did the passion for it start?
The passion started in infancy, basically. If you ask my parents, apparently, allegedly, my first word was car. It wasn't mum, it wasn't dad, it was car. So clearly there may be something in the DNA, but it's like any other thing in life that's a passion. You can list objective criteria why you like it, you can list subjective criteria why you like it, and you don't necessarily need a reason why it speaks to you. It might be just something you enjoy. I like motorsport, I like speed, things that are fast attract me. So if you like cars and you like speed, it's immediately you're going to restrict your area of interest into supercars. So why I like them, the engineering, the design, the exhilaration, and it was always an ambition of mine to get into, to drive a supercar, to have a supercar. But what's nice about the car community is you can share that passion for cars regardless of what's in your garage. You might have the $1,000 bomb, you might have the $1 million hypercar or $2 million hypercar, but two car guys are going to get along. You're still going to talk about the fastest car around the Nürburgring and how that lap time doesn't count because they stripped it and put tyres on and the whole lot. You know, you can still have that conversation, right? Or who's the greatest F1 driver? Is it Hamilton? No, it's Senna, or is it Schumacher? And, you know, so that bond is always going to be there because of that shared interest. And I think those sort of friendships and those sort of interactions as you go along become more and more important.
And that's a prime example of how you and I met, is at a track day where more than likely I had the cheapest car on the day, but they had all these different cars around. I was just going down to each garage, just speaking with as many people as possible, just because we're all here because we love cars. But you'll have a gentleman in a Ford Focus RS, there was a lady in a Mustang, I believe, on the night or something. There was all these different cars, yet there's this one thing which brings us all together, which is what FMIs is all about, is we all have this passion for cars, more specifically the exotic cars and things, because of their speed and the engineering that goes behind them. But that's precisely it, is we have this one passion, and I decided to come up and have a chat with you, and that's how we met, and here we are now sitting here having a chat, really.
So look, I mean, what you've just described, I have that experience commonly, where you meet new people through your hobbies and through what you enjoy doing, and it really only needs that one degree of commonality or connection, and that sort of sparks off a conversation, and then shared interests.
Exactly. No, you did say it's almost like you can't pinpoint exactly where your love for cars comes from. I mean, you said your first word was car, right? But what was your first interaction with a car that left a lasting impression? Like, did you see a car? Did you interact with an owner?
There's been a few. When I think to my early childhood now, this may be, I do believe I remember this, but I don't know whether this is a story that people repeat and then thereby sort of imbibe the memory. But I mean, certainly my childhood, the garage of my childhood was nothing like this. There was not a supercar in the garage of my childhood. So the first car I distinctly remember was my father had a Fiat, and we were living in an apartment building, and the apartment buildings were structured such that they were sort of arranged, you know, one building, second building, third building in a U, and there was a sort of central car park, open air car park. So my parents tell me when I would wake up in the morning, I would insist on ensuring that our vehicle was there, still there overnight before getting on with my day. So that would probably be my first memories, I think, of the development of an obsession with cars. The next memory I have was my father had an old Audi, I think 100. This is back in the early 80s. And I remember being on the motorway and the exhaust falling off on it. And then I also remember once, it was an old car which he bought, but you know, when you're a young child and it's your dad's car, you love it, okay? Even whether it's a bomb or not, you love it. And but as the interest grew, it was the performance vehicles that really got me. So in my ownership experience, I've had luxury vehicles and I've had performance vehicles. The luxury vehicles have not had a very long lifespan in my garage, just because it was the performance aspect and the speed aspect that spoke to me. And that aspect of performance at a rapid rate under pressure has parallels in other areas of my life. So it seemed like a very natural fit. So if you were to ask me, would I pick a supercar which is low to the ground and I have to cause a traffic jam when I'm going over a speed hump, or you know, a Rolls-Royce Phantom or the new Mercedes Maybach, I'd always pick the performance vehicles. So it's that, I think it's that dedication to a particular goal, and it's almost relentless. If you look at all the manufacturers, particularly those which have good racing pedigree, what are they all pursuing? And they're pursuing it over generations of engineers, generations of drivers, generations of people working in the factory. It's all to be the best at what they do, and that is to produce the best performance vehicles. Whether you like Ferraris, Porsches, McLarens, Lamborghinis, they all have their own culture and they all have their own flair and they all have their own way of pursuing that target, but that's the ultimate goal. They want to be able to say, we have produced in this segment the best performance vehicle. So it saddens me at times when I see manufacturers go away from that. I understand the economics of things, and that often means that they have no choice. but that's probably the purist in me speaking, that when I associate certain brands, I want them to do that particular thing, but we have to be realistic about this.
So like in a way, kind of like how all these the brands which typically tailor towards the more high-end sports cars or supercars, how they're now starting to bring in SUVs and things just to tailor towards that marketing.
Exactly. Look, I think we have to be realistic. I mean, ultimately, it's a tough gig. Car manufacturing is a tough gig, and they have to stay viable. And with the consolidation of car companies, often now engineers and or proud companies have become subsidiaries, and they're now answering to boards who are looking at production numbers and revenue. So, having said that, when you actually drive some of the SUVs of those brands, they're fantastic vehicles as well. You can absolutely see that. Look, they've produced a great vehicle. But for me, the purist in me is that, look, to me it doesn't really matter. I'm not focused on the brand per se. You could have a no frills brand, but if it's the best performing car in its segment, it's going to pique my attention. Then if I go and look at it and the people behind the brand are people I can establish a relationship with or a friendship with, then you've got me hook, line and sinker. And that's exactly what happened with McLaren, because when I jumped into McLaren early on, they were very well known in the racing, in the history of racing. They were a very successful racing company. But apart, they produced the F1, which is probably one of the, arguably the greatest of all time, road car. Then they produced in 2012, 2011, the MP412C, and then there was a gap of several years before the 650S landed, right? So I never really looked at them. I mean, the McLaren F1 was, I think, around at about 1990 to 94, I think that was its model life. So I was a 10-year-old to a 14-year-old, so that's an iconic vehicle for me, because during my formative years, that was top dog, right? Naturally aspirated BMW V12, and even if you look at its performance metrics today, it's highly relevant, right? Highly relevant, and you're looking back, 30 odd years, right? So I always revered the racing company. I think Porsches spoke to me a lot. I liked the fact that they seemed to be, it seems strange when you look at the wings on some of these things, but they seem to be a little bit more understated than some of the Italian brands, more performance focused. And that's when I was in the position to buy a performance vehicle. I migrated from BMWs to Porsches. So how I came to be with McLaren was on the basis of a recommendation that they're producing good vehicles, and then I drove it. And it was a complete game changer for me. It was worlds ahead in terms of its product development and its speed. And they've looked after me fantastically well. So to the extent where I have the number of the master tech and the guys who work on my car, and they will put up with 1,000,001 questions on a Sunday night. I will text them, they'll text me back. So particularly when I joined them, they were a very small company. And what I liked about it was the intimacy, because you would have access to people in the factory. When they had owners' days, the actual test drivers who were prototyping, the vehicle development, you could actually ask them questions. So, you've done this, why, and get an insight onto what they did. So I thought that's something special. I hope they never lose that. I know they tried to push volume, and now I'm hearing they're trying to bring it back again. So when they have spoken to me about it, I've said, look, obviously I'll be accused of being selfish because I'm a McLaren owner, but I thought my preference would be for them to keep the volume smaller and not lose that connection that if you want to have as an owner who's interested in the engineering and interested in performance driving, has with the factory, has with the guys who are actually designing and testing the car. And that's something that's very, very special for me. So as the company's grown, I've managed to maintain that, and I hope I never lose it. That's something which I value very, very highly. But at the end of the day, the product in my opinion, has to be the best in segment. And I think for the last 5 years, from about 2015 onwards, they have been.